Alison Haynes. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Julie.
It's great having you.
Yeah, it's really, really nice to talk to you. You're on your Sunday time, I think, and I'm
I
Monday.
I sure am. Yeah, I'm out in Canada. You're in Australia, so this is actually the first call that I do from that amount of distance, essentially. So yeah, you're the first, I guess, technically Australian
Oh,
that
that's
I've had.
fantastic. Yes, well,
Yeah.
I'm a dual citizen. To complicate matters, I'm English and I am Australian as well.
Okay. And so we met through Twitter because you have well, you're a scientist and you have an interest in urban moss, which I find fascinating because I actually also have a science account on Twitter and I research tardigrades which live in moss.
Yes, well, it's my ambition to see a tardigrade. I haven't seen one yet. I'm really hoping to, but yeah, I'm doing a PhD in the ecology and physiology of moss in the urban environment, sort of looking at sort of how it can survive, what what different habitats it can persist in, and sort of what makes life hard or easier for moss.
Before we get started talking about moss itself, can you tell me why you got interested in this?
So I suppose I went back to university s- um, after a career in journalism, and I did a science degree, and I did that part time while I worked on various things. I shifted my career from publishing centered to more towards science, and I really enjoyed it. It went really well. Then I did honors, which is like a mini research project, and then after then that went really well too. So then I was looking for a project to do for my PhD, and this was one of them. And I wanted to do something new, and the supervisor was seemed really good. I had a list of criteria actually, and that sort of led me to moss, and now I've yeah it's been something that I'm learning about, and I've really enjoyed.
I have to ask you just because I'm curious, what was on your list of criteria?
Well, so I wanted the supervisor was really important because I'd heard that sort of can make or break a PhD experience. I wanted someone who had a good lab group, so I didn't want to be just stuck by myself. I wanted someone who supported that and encouraged people to talk and be supportive of each other. I wanted some biodiversity, which by that I mean I wanted to sort of have some aspect of, well, what's here, um, and so that included some identification, and I wanted to learn a new skill, so that definitely included moss. Um, yeah, that's they were some of the main. I wanted the opportunities to collaborate. Yeah, so it was that kind of thing, and it could have been anything, but I was really, really happy to be doing moss, and it has been quite a journey of discovery.
Yeah, it's interesting because moss is something that most people don't even really think about. They walk all over it. It grows underneath our park benches in local parks. We see it almost every day, or maybe we don't because we're so busy focused walking to work or something. But it is one of those things that grows all around us that people aren't really aware about.
I know, and I think that is what I really liked about it, is that once you do start noticing, you start noticing it everywhere. So it sort of changes your view of the world a little bit, and that's something I really like. So now whenever I go anywhere new, like to different city or even a city I've been to before, I'm on the lookout for it. So I've got photographs of moss in the Jardin de Luxembourg in Paris, and on the castle in England near where I grew up. When I went there a few years ago, I was looking out for the moss. So I think that's really nice, the way that it sort of makes you look at things with a fresh eye.
Yeah, it's really beautiful too. That's the thing is that once you really start looking at moss, you start to realize how beautiful it is. Do
Mm.
you have like a specific type of moss that's your favorite?
Um, well, at the moment, I'm looking at moss in pavement cracks, which gets a lot of strange looks when I'm out on the street. Um, But one of the really lovely ones in there, I don't know its name yet, though I have a suspicion what it is. It's something which looks quite dark and almost just like a piece of dirt. in the crack. When you take a piece and you look at under the lens, you see that it's got these little tiny white hairs on them called hair points. And then if you moisten it, then it starts to brighten up and be quite sort of sprightly. And I find that really beautiful. So at the moment it's just got the name white hair point, but soon I'll be identifying it and know what species it is.
Is there a lot of moss in Australia? Because when I think of Australia, I think of a very kind of very hot, dry place. Are there a lot of species of moss in Australia, or maybe more specifically where you're at in Australia?
Yeah, so there are. I mean, I'm not sure exactly how many there are. I'm expecting to find about perhaps 30 in the city region where I am, so that will come under my study. But within Australia, there's many hundreds, and I think one of the things that people don't understand about moss is that there are thousands of species worldwide, and they've got sort of different traits or like powers, if you like. So some of them are really good at surviving in dry areas. So there are desert mosses, for instance, that are actually really important part of the desert. And they're being studied quite a bit in China. They're trying to sort of reintroduce moss as part of something called a biocrust, which can help retain like stop the soil sort of flying off and helping to pollute the cities. So it's although tend to associate moss with moist areas, maybe shady, moist um, forests. In fact, they can survive in a lot of different places.
Yeah, it's interesting because we briefly mentioned tardigrades, and it's actually not that hard to find them. I can give you some tips on how to find them, but one of the things is tardigrades in deserts is something that hasn't I don't think has been researched all that much. So
Okay.
I'm really curious, to see if maybe we could find some in the desert areas. So I would strongly, hopefully, encourage you to maybe collect some of that desert moss and start looking maybe.
Yeah, that would be really interesting. I'm a bit of away from the desert though, so I live on the east coast of Australia, like a lot of people. That's where most of the population of Australia lives. But I have worked in the desert on other things, so that would be really cool. So yeah, you're going to have to give me some tips, Julie.
Oh yeah, for sure. Well, I mean, what's interesting is that you're looking in sidewalk cracks, which is actually one of the best spots to find them.
Ah,
I I get the same looks because I look for tardigrades on my balcony, which is where I found 3 or 4 different species of tardigrades in the hundreds. I mean,
oh
every time it
wow.
rains, I go out on my balcony and I collect a little bit of water, and I put that in a petri dish and I put that under the microscope. So I think the most common way to find tardigrades in moss is just to soak the moss in water for, like, an hour,
Oh really? Oh
really.
wow. Okay.
Yeah, and then you take that water and you put it under the microscope.
Mm. And what's the best sort of magnification to look at them?
Y y any
Any?
essentially
Yeah.
4x you would see
Okay.
them
Really?
immediately.
Okay.
So oh yeah, even 1x you'll see, like, the bigger species.
Oh wow.
So, yeah, I really hope that you find some.
Yeah.
Or
I feel it. I feel positive. I feel optimistic.
Yeah, I figured I'd bring it up because you do work with moss, so that's such a popular way of finding tardigrades. So
Mm,
I find that really cool. Speaking of creatures, just I know that's not exactly your field
mm.
of study, but what other kind of creatures do you tend to find when you're out looking for moss?
Um, so when I'm looking, I just see what do I see? I see millipedes and things like that, sort of in the same area. But I once took this really flat piece of moss from a quite a sort of a fairly polluted road, and it was really stunted. But I looked under the microscope, and I was absolutely thrilled to see this bright red mite sort of marching around. And I really like the idea that there's life sort of everywhere. It just depends how you look.
Yeah, and that's one of my reasons for asking is because you're studying, moss in urban environments. The growth of moss must attract these creatures, which means it makes for a thriving ecosystem.
Yeah, I think that is a possibility, but I think as well in urban environments, sometimes the moss is struggling. It depends exactly where it is, but it's sort of a bit hanging in there. One of my other studies, I collaborated with a Polish researcher who was visiting, and his specialty was looking at particulate matter. like little tiny particles on leaves as a way of sort of phytoremediation, sort of improving the city air with plants. And we looked at the same spots, but I would look at moss and he would look at leaves, and when he had this method for taking off the particulate matter. But I also took some stress measurements of moss in like on a gradient, and least urban to more urban, and quite consistently the ones in the more urban areas were more stressed. So it can be tougher for moss.
Okay. Hmm. Yeah, I do wonder because I find, I in Ottawa at least it's a very green city. So you tend to find moss, like I said, under park benches. You find them crawling along walls and stuff like that. What other areas would you commonly find moss in a city?
Yeah, brick walls under leaky pipes is a common one. As you've mentioned, well, we've talked about sidewalks, but that's sort of smallish. In little tiny urban green areas, like where there's a bit of grass, that's where there's going to be most biodiversity. So I've just begun to look at that kind of area, and sometimes in one little park you might get sort of a 9 species. So I think as far as diversity, that's quite interesting. I'm trying to think of some of the other places I've seen moss. Oh, just like by a drain pipe. I've got a nice picture I took in Wellington in New Zealand of a drain and water gushing down it, and there's some moss that's just taken residence there and is quite happy. Obviously, quite that one must be quite tolerant of being a bit waterlogged. Yeah, so there's has different sort of characteristics will sort of dictate where they can survive.
And as some mosses are struggling, can you get invasive moss in the city? And I'll explain why I'm asking is because I'm originally from Northern Ontario and I grew up with a big forest in the backyard. One of the things we've noticed in recent years is that the moss is pretty much taking over the forest floor and it's like pretty much killing everything. I'm wondering, are there urban versions of like an invasive moss?
So I don't know of any invasive ones in my own city, but I have heard that can happen. And I think something sometimes that changes is that um, you might get a moss coming in that's got quite a tolerance for, say, a particular metal, something like that. And if it's got that tolerance at a greater level than something else, then it might start to take over. Usually, it doesn't compete well with vascular plants, things like grass, because its moss is usually very slow growing. But I think definitely there are instances of invasive mosses.
Okay. And being so you're researching urban moss. What do you do with this research afterwards? What is it? I mean, do you apply it to learn something about perhaps climate change or urbanization? What for you is like the ultimate goal of this research?
So all of those things actually, it touches on sustainable cities. Like there are applications, things like on green roofs. Perhaps moss can help other plants survive better, because moss can retain water. It can slow water, so it can help with stormwater management. It perhaps can hold particulate matter. There's a whole range of things, but I guess for me, the project was first of all presented to me in terms of like moss on green roofs. But when I started looking at moss in urban areas, there wasn't much information on it. So I decided to sort of pedal back a bit and try to get some basics about which mosses and why moss can survive in the urban area, with a view to, yeah, my final chapter of my PhD will be all about all the different possible applications. So I'm just sort of gathering together some of that information now, but it's quite early days. But I think it has got a role, a little bit like you were talking about the forest floor. I think cities, we've thought of trees and we've thought of shrubs and things like that, but we're not thinking of all the different aspects of a complex ecosystem. And so I like to think that moss has got a role in those in small areas, and maybe adding to the complexity of urban greening.
Yeah, I have to admit I would love a full lawn of moss because there's nothing like walking barefoot on moss. Have you
Yeah.
ever done it?
No, I haven't. So I only see, like in the urban environment, I just see very small little pieces. It doesn't get the chance to grow into big beds usually. Trying to think, and then when I've seen it out, say in the bush, yeah, it's probably been a bit cold or it's a bit, so I haven't haven't taken my boots off. But I think you have to go to Japan because they have really amazing moss sort of carpets there, and I think in cities as well. Like they have moss temples. I'd love to go there and see the different things they do with moss in Japan.
Yeah, that could be a good idea for a postdoc, maybe.
Exactly. Once we can travel again, we're not allowed out of Australia at the moment.
Mhm. Right, right, of course.
Yeah, yeah.
I definitely was not thinking now. I was
Yeah.
thinking of a world again when we can travel. But
Yes, well, that will
yeah, I
happen.
mean, if Japan can do it, I wonder if it is possible to build, sustainable roofs or lawns or whatever out of moss. I mean, is that the only international example that you can think of? Or
So moss is being used in other areas on roofs, but not necessarily in a sort of an aesthetic way, because it does depend on the sort of the um, well, like the local climate and that kind of thing. So, for instance, in Portugal, there's a group of people that have been um, they they've been looking at how moss can help other plants survive on a green roof, and they found that it does help, and it means that they use less water, but it's not necessarily going to look that attractive all year round. So, like in I think in Japan, it possibly some of those places are more moist, so they look quite lush. But yeah, moss can spend some time looking a bit dry and possibly not that attractive, but it's still doing a good job. So I think we have to sort of not expect too much of it. I'm sort of wary of overselling it because people might be a bit disappointed.
Of course. Yeah, one of the people that I spoke with recently is an expert in biodesign.
Mm,
So I think this kind of touches on that topic, right? Because we're using nature to inspire perhaps new designs for the future.
yeah, definitely. And I've been talking to a number of designers actually, and we're trying to because one of my experiments, I created some tiles with different textures and try to see if that affected moss colonization. And some people are quite interested in that, so they're interested in sort of taking that a step further and looking at some of the ways that they can create different surfaces for buildings that maybe can encourage colonization, and that's happened a little bit in Europe, but not I haven't seen it in Australia. Yeah, but I'm definitely interested in that. I think that's really fascinating.
Tiles and textures, now you've got my attention. I'm really curious about that because I want to know what you tried. What did you find out? Tell me more.
Well, the first thing, which was quite funny, was that I ended up having to learn a bit about concrete, and I actually cast these concrete tiles myself because I wanted to see. Like I'd noticed that obviously pavement cracks. There's a bit of a depth there, and if they're too shallow, there's no there's nothing for sort of moss to get hold of. So I was aware that texture and what we call microtopography really makes a difference. But I wanted to do an experiment on an urban gradient with that, but I couldn't find any tiles that had enough texture. So I needed a depth of getting on for a centimeter. So I actually made some models myself out of cardboard, and then I made some silicon molds. It was very took ages, and then I cast concrete, and I made I think about 250 small tiles, which I then put on these panels. And yeah, people were fascinated with them. And what I found was that they, yeah, the sort of like a niche design, like where there was sort of a depth that, as opposed to a relief where things stood up, that really made a difference. And I did some experiments in people's gardens, and then I did another one where I just did it in one place, and I added water each week and had some in shade, and the shade actually made a huge difference.
Huh. Did you publish that anywhere or do you have it like on a website somewhere?
So I've done some presentations where I've shown pictures of those, but I haven't published it yet. I've got the results in, but I've just got one last survey to do, so I'm trying to do that, and then I'm going to be starting to write up.
Okay. Yeah, it's curious because now you've just introduced a new word in my vocabulary, which
Yeah.
is microtopography, which I've
Yes.
never heard of before.
Ah, there you are. Microtopography affects microclimate. So down at that really small scale, it's little bit extra shade can mean that the temperature drops. It can mean that water is retained for that little bit longer, which can make a big difference to a slow growing plant like moss. Yeah, so it's quite fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting because one of the things I'm trying to do, so my partner and I are going to probably move to Prince Edward Island or somewhere in the East Coast next year. And one of the things I really want to do is find a way to bring my tardigrades with me, the ones that are living on my balcony, right? And
Ah,
it's cement balcony, but there's
mm,
cracks.
yeah,
So I think you've just inspired me to perhaps try to build some blocks and see if I can, you know, keep them
yeah,
alive.
yeah, definitely. You can. I think you could do that. So I used. Yeah, so I made a pattern that was what I wanted, and then I used these silicon. It's sort of which is like so you get like a rubbery mold, and then somebody at uni who made his own concrete planters. He said, "Oh, I've got a book with concrete recipes," and so I just used a very simple concrete recipe there. I had to learn about, I can't even remember what they're called now, but you have sand and concrete. Like, it's not just the concrete. 'Cause if it's just concrete, it's too or cement, it's too weak. But I can send you my concrete recipe if you like.
Oh, I would love that
Yeah,
for sure.
I'll share it. I'll share it on Twitter. That would be good.
Yes, it would be actually. So one of the things that came up recently is I saw an article in the CBC. It's a man actually on Prince Edward Island, a retired scientist, and he tracked all the species of microfungi on PEI, and his name is Adrian Carter, by the way. Um, the reason I bring him up is because I didn't know that there was such a thing as microfungi or fungi or fungi. I know there's an international way of pronouncing that word. Uh, so I guess what I wanted to know is there such a thing as a micro moss?
Um, well, not really. So moss you can see with the naked eye. I suppose that's a definition. Yeah, so I say fungi, but that's I suppose the thing with fungi is that it's a whole kingdom. And if you think of mold, I mean, mold is fungi, so it's a really broad group. Whereas moss, like there's small moss, but not so much. I would not that I would call micro. Like you do,
Okay.
yeah, you'll see a lot more under. It's worth looking at them under a microscope, and when you identify them, you have to actually look at the cells and things like that. So you do need a microscope. And they're only what the thing about moss is the leaves are only one cell thick. So sort of I think for me they sort of bridge that gap between micro and macro. They're just visible. They're visible with the naked eye, but you do need to sort of get a microscope out as well.
And they're so beautiful under a microscope. There's nothing I enjoy more than looking at moss under the microscope.
So have you looked at it rehydrating? Because that's really amazing.
Yeah, under what? So yeah, I because I frequently look for tardigrades in moss.
Mm,
Some little pieces of moss end up in the water that I'm looking under the microscope, and it's just so beautiful. The green, first of all, the color is gorgeous, but also the shapes and I love it.
yeah. Yeah, there's all different, and they're quite different shapes. The leaves can be pointy or round, or they can have a hair point. Or so once you start looking, I mean, you're probably seeing a few different species. Do you reckon?
I guess, but again, I don't know a whole lot about moss, right? Moss
Mm.
species, I don't know.
So you look if you see the shape of the leaves, like if you see some, you might see with a pointy leaf, and others might be rounded. So like I think once you take note of the leaf shape, if you see different leaf shapes, you're basically seeing different species.
Which I guess is a great question to ask you then is what can somebody who's a beginner, what's the best way to start learning about moss and identifying species?
So I think the first thing would be to get yourself a hand lens. They're really cheap. And you just need maybe 10 times, or I think you can get 20 times ones, but just get a hand lens and start to look at it. And then you'll notice. You'll start noticing the different kinds. You can call them field names to begin with, so don't get too worried about if you can't find their exact species. And then you'd have to, I'd say, look up probably some maybe an online resource of your local area. That might be the best. But to be honest, I mean, I'm still at the beginning of my ID journey, and if you want to identify absolutely to genus, that can be quite hard. But you've got to start somewhere.
That's the thing, right? I mean, I have been using a microscope for only a year, so I mean, it's doable. You can totally go and explore. It's definitely possible.
Yeah, and I
Uh,
think don't get too caught up in thinking, well, I've got to have the right
yeah,
absolute right name.
exactly, exactly. Are there common names for moss? Like, I don't know, like in the microscopic world, you'll call a copepod a cyclops. Are
Okay.
there common names for moss, or is it all Latin?
Oh no, there are common names. So one species that you'll probably see in your city is Bryum argentium. It's actually a moss which is found on every continent, I think, even Antarctica. And that's called. But it has several names. But one of them is the silver moss, and it's recognizable because it is quite silvery. So if you see a moss that's a bit silvery, and if you look on the hand lens and it's almost got little chubby leaves, almost like little sort of round cabbages, then that's silver moss. And then you'll get some things. I'm trying to. There's another one called fire. Tends to be called fire moss because it comes up after fire quite a bit, and that one is Ceratodon purpureus. So there are common names as well.
It's curious. I have to ask now, because you mentioned silver moss, which is interesting because I guess I thought maybe that was always lichen because it was silver.
So there is a moss called silver moss, and the reason it's silver is because the tip of its leaf doesn't have any chloroplasts in it, and this
Oh.
is it's a it's a moss that's also found in the desert. It has high desiccation tolerance, so it's very able to sort of survive heat and bright light, and that tip of its leaf actually protects the chloroplast lower down in the leaf. So that's sort of its sort of strategy for surviving bright light.
Okay, so what would be the difference between moss and lichen?
So if you get your hand lens or whatever, so a moss is going to have leaves, whereas a lichen can be is usually a bit more like a crust. It's a bit more crusty, and doesn't actually have separate leaves. But something that you might get muddled up with as well is something called a liverwort. And there are some leafy liverworts which are a little bit like moss, and there are particular definitions like why it would be one and not the other. But generally, look, moss is leafy, and you'll sometimes see when it's at the right time of year, you'll see these little stalks with little capsules on the top, and that's called the sporophyte. And yeah, you don't get that with a lichen.
That's what I was actually going to ask you next because I think I told you this is that in this spring I went out and I collected moss and I got these beautiful little bottles, and I created little moss gardens and they're just growing so well in those bottles and still to this day it's beautiful, it's green. And when I first collected them it had those little stalks. What do those stalks do?
So that's the sexual reproductive part of the moss, and they're actually individual organisms. They're growing out of the leafy green bit is called the gametophyte, and that's sort of like acts like the parent. And those sporophytes grow out of the leafy green bit and are totally dependent on their parent for their food. They that little bobble up the top that is where spores grow. And when it's quite funny because there's like a little bit of tissue called a calyptra, and that's almost like a little beanie that's on that capsule, and that's a piece of parent tissue. And when the parent says it's ready, then it allows that capsule up the top to open, and the spores will come out, and that's what how a new moss can grow from those spores.
My mind is blown because I legitimately had no idea that moss produce. Spores.
Well, there you are. Yeah, so they're really tiny and they're wind blown. So that's why some species have quite wide range. So it's probably that like Bryum argenteum and Ceratodon purpureus. They're probably been blown around over thousands and thousands of years, and because they have really sort of wide survival capabilities, they've been able to colonize lots of different places around the world.
Wow. I'm gonna spend a lot more time researching moss after this talk, that's for sure. I have
Yeah.
to ask you this question,
Yep.
Allison, because my partner and I were talking about this interview this morning, and I was joking with her. I was like, I'm surprised, Australia, to me is all snakes and spiders and everything's trying to kill you. And then she said to me just jokingly, she's like, I wonder if there's toxic moss. And I was like,
Mm.
I will ask my guests. So, Allison, is there such a thing as a toxic moss?
Well, well, I've never been attacked by a moss. I can say that. um, I don't know because I mean, we don't try to eat it, do we? So I haven't heard of people trying to eat it. I haven't heard of a toxic moss, but it's not impossible. I suppose one way that it might end up being toxic is that some mosses can retain heavy metals. They can sort of absorb them into their tissues and survive, and not be killed. And in that way, that moss maybe then becomes a bit of a package of something that you wouldn't want to sort of well, you definitely wouldn't want to eat it. But yeah, look, I can't say I have, but it sometimes doesn't assist. Like you notice that in some areas it's not allowing other plants to grow, and that can happen. So yeah,
Okay.
a new question.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just curious because, other plants, you have plants that, like you said, if an animal or human eats them, they die or it causes a terrible itch or something. And so I was always curious, too,
Mm.
about that, whether or not, because we've always handled moss, wherever I go, I'll touch moss, but it never crossed my mind to wonder about that.
No, no, and I actually haven't heard any. I think maybe it would be the type of thing that would come up in like a sort of indigenous law as well. That
Ah,
if there was something toxic, whereas I have heard of them being used for like as sponges, things like sphagnum moss. But yeah, I haven't heard of that being a problem.
okay. And speaking of Australia, the land of spiders and snakes, um, so you're originally from England and now you live in Australia. What's been the cultural shift like?
Um, well, I've been here, I think about 30 years now. So
Oh, okay.
yeah, I've got used to a few things, but you do have to be careful of spiders. There are two particular ones in my area. One's a funnel web spider, Sydney funnel web, and another is called a redback. I don't see the redbacks very much. Basically, if you as long as you don't go poking around, you're not going to be likely to see them. And the same with snakes. Like there are some poisonous snakes in my region, but generally if you're walking in the bush, they'll hear you and they'll run away. Like they don't want to see you any more than you want to see them. But I was once with some international visitors, and we'd walked quite a way to walk onto this very special beach, and we saw a brown snake on the path, and the person who was leading the group decided that we wouldn't risk going past it because it can be really really serious. So you do have to be careful, and you like if you part of your first aid kit is a bandage for snake bite. Um, and but yeah, you're asking me about cultural shift. I think yeah, actually the cockroaches are probably the worst thing. Get giant cockroaches. I wasn't sort of used to that, but you get used to anything, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing to deal with the environment, but yeah, I mean, culturally speaking, is it very different living in Australia than living in England?
Um, let's see. So I suppose there's a sort of a commonality which makes it not as big a shift as say if I went to I don't know some village in Africa or something like that. But I'm trying to think. I've been used to living in different places, and so I'm sort of quite adaptable. But I mean, there are differences, obviously. I guess there's more of an outdoor culture here. I think it's yeah, like I'm saying, you can tell I'm struggling to sort of to sort
Mhm.
of think of different things which are culturally different. I mean, it is, but not sort of unrecognizably. I mean, but I would imagine it'd be the same for, if someone from Canada came to Australia, there's a lot of recognizable aspects of cultural life. There's the museums, plays, films, all of those are there's a sort of quite a similarity.
Right. And I guess the food, how's the food?
Food is pretty good, actually, and I think that was something that did surprise me when I first came, just how good the food was. There's quite a lot of Italian migration in the I'm not sure, it would be say 50s, 60s, and I think that sort of meant that the coffee in Australia when I first came was a hell of a lot better than England, and England didn't have a really good reputation of, you know, very good sort of cafe food and stuff. But that's picked up. It's sort of everything changes, but we get like we the food is pretty amazing. Get a lot of variety, a lot of Thai food, Vietnamese, Japanese, and the produce is pretty good quality, actually. So yeah, you can eat very well. I think you can have a good life here relatively cheaply.
Okay. When you were in England, you were a journalist, right?
Yeah, actually I originally did law, English and French law, and then I got my first journalist job. I wanted to go into journalism. I didn't want to go into law. Had my first journalism job in England, and then soon after that is when I moved to Australia. So I had work here in Australia as a journalist as well.
What kind of journalism? Was it writing or video production or what?
Yeah, it was writing. So it was the first my first job was in trade journalism. It was a, a magazine called Retail Week. It was sort of like a business to business kind of magazine with a really good editor, actually, who went on to be editing the Sunday Times magazine. So she had very good standards. So it was a really good start. So I started off doing news reporting, and then I did feature writing. And then when I moved to Australia, I did a bit of that for a while. And then I moved on to, I worked for Choice magazine, which is a bit like, I don't know what the equivalent in Canada is, but in America it's Consumer Reports. So it's that sort of consumer um, type of thing. And then I worked for Reader's Digest magazine as a feature writer. So I was writing and editing.
Okay, yeah. It's something I can actually totally relate to. I used to be a freelance writer for the film industry. So, animation magazines, film industry
Yeah.
magazines, that kind of thing. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. For a while it is. I don't know what it's like now, though.
Yeah, look, it was a lot of fun, and I had some really good trips. I went to Istanbul with some Austrian shop fitters, and we went. Yeah, they took us around. They even gave us spending money, which was like really bizarre. Yeah, so I had some, and with Reader's Digest had some really good stories as well, including one where we in Australia looked for extinct marsupials in this sort of caving system. But yeah, going back
Ooh.
to the trade journalism, yes, it's good. You make your contacts, you get your rounds. Yeah, but journalism's changed a lot now. My husband's was a travel writer, and that's almost like dried up. Yeah, so it's a very different world.
Yeah, I mean, it's all become content writing now, I think.
Yeah, and lots of people will do a lot of writing for nothing. They just like to
Yeah.
see their name there. So it's harder to be a freelance journalist now, I think.
Is that one of the reasons why you switched professions?
I suppose. So what happened to me was I when I had children, I was working for Reader's Digest magazine, and my first son, I managed to stay part time for quite a while, and then they were pushing me to go back full time. So I did, and I didn't like that what that did to sort of like my childcare arrangements and stuff, and I felt really unhappy about that. So I decided I would go freelance, and then I moved more towards book editing, and it was going okay, and I did that for quite a while. Um, and then we moved out of Sydney to where I am now, which is a much more natural place. And just yeah, just things started to shift. I for a few years I was writing books, but it was like hard to get a project up and going. Like you'd have a sort of a thing which you do for a while, and then it would take another 6 months to get another contract. And at the same time, I started seeing more. I was being out in the natural world more, and I was camping in the like without tents and that kind of stuff. And I just started thinking about, oh, maybe I should have done a biology degree after all those years ago. So yeah, it was sort of a combination of things.
Do you are you familiar with the new move towards science communication now?
So when you say new move, what are you thinking of?
In the sense that it's more popular, it's becoming more of a new move academically. So now universities are offering master's degrees in science communication. Content writing for science is big. There are new and improved science magazines because science communication is becoming a bit of a hot topic right now.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and I do really like it. And I suppose that's where the Twitter comes in, how we connected. That's that. I suppose that's part of it, and it's something I feel like I want to learn more about. Yeah, it's definitely something that interests me. There's been a new. I'm trying to think what it is. It's sort of like a roundup thing that where there's a really good little website thing you can subscribe to, and I think once a week they give a roundup of different tips and stuff like that. So that's something that I've just joined lately. Yeah, I mean, that's something that I'm really really interested in. Is and obviously you do a bit of that.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of it I started doing it without knowing that that's what it was called, you know what I mean? It's one of those things where now I'm known as a science communicator, but I never gave myself that title, you know? It's just, I fit into a category, I guess.
Yeah. So do you have a science background as well?
I don't at all. In fact, I dropped out of university 7 times. So
Hmm.
on paper, I have a high school education, but I mean, I worked God, I've had so many different jobs. I've worked in technology for over 20 years.
Mm.
Recently got laid off from a software management position. But I mean, it's one of those things where science, communication, writing, doing anything online these days doesn't require even a grad school education or a degree.
No, I mean it's the communication bit, isn't it? And the passion and the asking questions and all of that, which will sort of help you move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. It really comes down to that. It comes down. I mean, I think passion has to drive it because otherwise, you're just kind of drudging along and not enjoying it, and it's very overwhelming. There's just a
Mm.
lot, like Twitch, for example. I don't know if you're familiar with Twitch, but it's an online gaming platform, which is where I decided to show people my tardigrades.
Oh,
So,
okay. No, I don't know that, but I'll
yeah.
have to take a look.
You should check it out. I'm trying
Yeah.
to get more scientists on there, but
Okay.
it's definitely the reason I brought it up is because you have a journalism background and now you're doing a PhD. I'm just wondering if you ever thought about combining the 2.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. But I'm not. Yeah, I just sort of. I suppose I just take it all a bit sort of. Well, this year sometimes it's been day by day. It's been such a strange year. It's definitely something that I will always want to do have as part of the mix of things that I do. So yeah, we'll see what's available when I finish. And,
Okay. Uh, you do write a blog, which is I'll just get the URL here. I have AlisonHaynes.wordpress.com.
yes, I call
Uh,
it wildlife here.
okay.
Yeah. I haven't. It's not something I do regularly, and I wish I could, but it's such a take. I was surprised sort of quite how much time it takes to do a blog piece, but I've got a few pieces up there now.
Yeah, because you recently went to Antarctica.
I did. I was extremely lucky,
Yeah.
and went to Antarctica at the beginning of this year.
And what did you do there?
So I went with people from Brazil, some scientists from Brazil, and I was the sort of the representative from my lab here in Australia, from the Sharon Robinson lab, and they wanted someone to collaborate from our lab because they didn't have any like any physiology experts, and I was helping them look at moss where glaciers are retreating on King George Island. So I went with them. I was away for 6 weeks, and I camped on King George Island for a month.
So King George Island, that's, is that, like, on the north side of Antarctica,
So
I
it's,
guess?
I think it's called you think of it as the West. So it's the bit that if you can imagine South America and Chile at the bottom, and then
Mhm.
Antarctica, if you look at it with Chile on your sort of left, there's a big hook. Antarctica is like a round circle, then has like a bit of a fish hook on the west, and King George Island is off that hook.
And you went at during the winter? Are there seasons there?
Yes, there's very
I guess
definitely
not.
seasons. Yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, you actually go, so you go there in the summer, but summer means, so I'm trying to think what temperature it got to. I mean, it wasn't hugely extreme, and it would be more extreme, I'd say, probably in parts of Canada. But in the summer in Antarctica, where I was, it got to about -8, and then some days would be like I think probably about 4, something like that.
Wow, that's actually pretty good.
Yeah, it was. It wasn't bad. So for people that like their warm days, obviously, it's you're not going to sunbathe or anything, but
Yeah.
it's doable.
Just to clarify, was that 4 degrees Celsius?
Yes.
Okay, so yeah,
Yeah.
that's exactly what it was today here in Ottawa, actually,
Well,
so
there you are. Yeah.
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 Yeah, it's not too bad. But what is it like to go to a place that most people don't go to?
It was, yeah, like it was very, very special. I mean, one of the things is it takes a lot of effort and support, sort of technical support, logistical support to actually get there. So we flew on a Hercules plane from Punta Arenas in Chile, and then we landed at an airport called Frey on King George Island. And then from there, we went on to a Navy ship, the Brazilian Navy, and they like the next day took us by little zodiac boats back and forth with all our gear onto this island. And yeah, it was very, I wasn't sure what I was going to feel like because I thought, oh, it's going to be this big landscape, and will I be able to relate to it? But in fact, where we were was like a little cove, quite a sort of a rocky cove. It was very, very beautiful. I mean, very quite harsh at times, but yeah, very, very special.
Some of your blog posts are titled "Yoga in Antarctica." Is that just a title for fun, or did you actually do yoga there?
I did do yoga, and the reason it's called I got yoga in Antarctica is I had the idea before I went, like, how do you look after yourself in an extreme environment like that? And I sort of thought, yeah, you're looking after yourself, and you're also interested in what it's like. Oh, do you get a bit of an insight into the planet as well? Because obviously Antarctica is a place where climate change is the effects of it are quite extreme. So the yoga in Antarctica comes from the idea that I have a what I call my well-being routine here, and it includes yoga most days. And I thought, well, yeah, how do you do that in Antarctica? So yeah, I'm there will be there will be a piece which is more about the yoga, and it was difficult, but I one of the things I did was I just had to sort of drop the idea that you roll out your mat and do your 20 minutes. So I had
Mhm.
sleep inside sleeping bag yoga, on sleeping bag yoga, grabbed yoga, which is sort of you're out in the field and think, oh, actually, no one's looking, and I've got a moment here, and I'll just do a warrior pose or something. So I was very interested in how you sort of maintain well-being in such an extreme place.
That would have been a fun YouTube channel to have. Just, while you were in Antarctica to do yoga and, teach you do a few yoga lessons through YouTube. I think that would have been a real hit.
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll have to do that next time. Good idea.
Yeah. Is there gonna be a next time? Is that already in the works?
No, like I don't know. Who knows? I just don't know. This was very unexpected because so we've talked about my research is urban, but this was Antarctica. So this sort of came up out of the blue, and I and when it first was proposed, and then it fell through, and then it sort of popped up again. So like I barely believed I was going to go until just a couple of weeks before it actually got my ticket and stuff. So yeah, like I'm not sure, but we'll see. I would go again.
Okay. So take me through the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years. When do you think you'll be done your PhD, and what comes after?
So I hope to finish my PhD sometime next year. I had hoped it would be the end of this year, but it's been a really disruptive year for everybody, and including me. So hoping next year. So I've just got the one survey to do now, which I'm two-thirds the way through. So by Christmas, I'll have done all my experiments, and then start the writing up. I've done some of the writing already. So, and then after that, um, it really will depend on what's available. I'd love to do a postdoc. I like working sort of multidisciplinary teams. I've enjoyed sort of advising some designers about moss in the urban environment. Or who knows, maybe I'll do something totally different. But I have built up a bit of I wouldn't say expertise, but some knowledge about moss in urban environments. So it would be lovely if I can help apply that to another situation. Even maybe there's quite a bit of talk of mental health and green cities, and maybe there's a role for moss in small places and something like that.
Oh, that's very, very interesting. I have seen, now that I think about it, I have seen moss walls, like living walls, I think they're called.
Yeah. So those, yes, they had often they are plants, and I mean like higher plants, and moss will grow on that as well. Usually, those walls have got a lot of water happening on them, so but they sometimes use like grey water from the building. But it
Okay.
would so one of the things I'm talking about with the designer is how you could sort of make use of just water, and more that microtopography kind of aspect, and maybe so that you wouldn't need to sort of pump water at them to keep them alive.
Okay. Yeah, I was curious because I saw that in my dentist office in Montreal. They had like some sort of like moss wall, and it looked like it was alive. So, yeah, I guess that would be a great way to, because I found that really soothing, and especially in
Mm,
a dentist's office to have a
that's
moss wall was really nice.
that's really cool. I might have to find out about that dentist.
Yeah. Uh, One last question for you. If you could research moss in three very different urban cities across the world, what would those three cities be?
Hmm. Well, I'd like to go to Japan. So maybe I don't know the cities well enough in Japan to pick one, but let's say Tokyo. It would be cool to go back to Paris again. They've got quite a good sort of urban biodiversity, like research happening there, so that would be really cool. Where else would I go? Um, hmm, it would be really neat to go to somewhere in Africa because I've barely seen anything about moss in urban places in Africa, so that would be very cool. Yeah, I'm not sure where though.
Yeah.
Maybe, yeah. Any
Maybe
ideas?
like Johannesburg.
Yeah, that would
Johannesburg,
be a good
Cape
start,
Town,
wouldn't
Cape
it?
Town.
Yep, yep. That would be
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Listen, this has been so much fun. When we first talked and I was like, "Okay, urban moss. So how do I frame this interview?" And I was like, "I'm just going to ask about it because moss on its own is already something that's super fascinating. It's super whimsical. It's in all the kind of Japanese films, right? You see the moss and it's very curious to learn more about, moss, especially in the urban context. But as you just brought up, with mental health, biodesign, all the opportunities that could come out of that. So I wish you all the best with your research,
Thanks,
and
Julie.
I just want to say thanks.
It's been really great to talk to you, and I'm convinced you're now going to be like checking out Moss even more, and I'm going to be
Oh,
checking out those
absolutely.
tardigrades.
Yes,
Yeah.
please do. Thanks, Allison.